All right. Welcome again, everybody. Thank you once again for being here this evening with us. First off, I will ask everyone to please mute yourself if you're not speaking. My name is Jesse George. I am the New Orleans Policy Director with the Alliance for Affordable Energy. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation, and I'm a lifelong resident of South Louisiana. I was born and raised in Calcasieu Parish, and I've lived in New Orleans now for about 17 years. We've got a great slate of guests lined up tonight for this teach-in we're calling Turn Off the Gaslight, Natural Truth About Gas. I'll let them introduce themselves. First, we have Jane Patton with the Center for International Environmental Law, and then we'll do James and then Zach.
All right, so I'm gonna jump right in and tell you all a little bit about me. Tonight I am playing the roles of both myself and Scott Eustace from our partners at Healthy Golf, so you'll have to forgive me that I'm doing a little bit of double team work here. So as Jesse said, I'm Jane Patton. I am the campaigns manager for plastics and petrochemicals with the Center for International Environmental Law. CL is an organization that is predominantly made up of lawyers, as you would guess from its name, that we have offices in both DC and Geneva. And our work spans across many environmental law spaces, looking at the intersection between the environment, the law, and human rights. So I specialize on plastics and petrochemicals, and that work sits across our teams focused on climate and energy and environmental health. And we also have a team focused on people, land, and resources that does things like work against extractive financing and in support of indigenous communities around the world, mostly in South and Central America. So I am going to be talking, at least in this first part, about what natural gas is and where it comes from. Could you hit that slide for me, Jesse?
Oh, I was going to have everybody introduce themselves.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay,
no
introductions and then the slides. Perfect. So James then after me.
Sure, that's great. I'm James Hyatt. I'm the Southwest Louisiana coordinator for the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. I'm located here in Lake Charles, Louisiana, in Calcasieu Parish. Over here in the heel of the boot, as we like to say sometimes. I am a former refinery operator and a lab analyst, and currently working for the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, specifically focused on the petrochem and natural gas, liquefied natural gas build out that's trying to come into South Louisiana and all along the Gulf Coast. Louisiana Bucket Brigade does a lot of work in St. James and St. John and the river parishes. And really the most marginalized and affected fence line communities, standing in support of those, and now in Southwest Louisiana trying to prevent any more communities from becoming fence line communities where there's not already these massive 100,000 acres, these huge facilities they're trying to place right here on the coastline. And so I'll be speaking a little bit about who sets the price of the methane and why your electricity bill is so high. I'll pass it over to Zach. Thank y'all.
Thanks, James. It's good to see y'all. My name's Zach Kopkin. I use he, him pronouns. I am an organizer with the Sierra Club based in Bulbancha or New Orleans. The background that I'm bringing to the conversation today, I'm a pretty newish transplant to Louisiana. I've been here for about a year and a half. I grew up in Georgia and spent most of my adult life in North Carolina and Appalachia. And so I think a lot about the way that different fence line, frontline places, different regions like Appalachia and the Gulf are connected, and how the things that we've seen play out with coal and that transition in the mountains, how we can learn from that here in the Gulf South as we think about what does it look like to transition and build a future where we can all live and thrive in harmony with each other and the earth. And I'll be talking about how methane affects your utility bills. So I work on LNG exports. So I'll talk more about what is LNG, I know James will talk about that as well, was liquefied natural gas. How does it get exported? And when it gets exported, what does that do to our bills? So I'm really excited to get to share that with y'all and to hear what questions you have as well. And I've got this fun LNG shirt, and be happy to figure out a way to get them to you. I've got lots of them.
Thank you all. Thanks to all our panelists. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. As I asked at the beginning, please keep yourself muted. If you're not speaking, we'll have ample time at the end for question and answer. So please reserve your questions until then. When we do open the floor for questions, please use the raise hand function if you would like to ask a question, and we'll call on you in sequential order. To the speakers, I'll be controlling the slide, so just let me know when you're ready for the next slide. And with that, I'll kick it back over to Jane.
All right. And as you can tell in our introductions, you might hear the same information multiple times from us tonight. And I think on some level that's okay, because a lot of it is very technical. There's a lot of information to know and remember. And I also just realized that I forgot to say that I'm from Baton Rouge originally and live in New Orleans, and have been in South Louisiana my whole life. And so the understanding that I have of this system is relatively new, though, because it's real easy to like live nearby, see the refineries, see the petrochemicals, and know that they're hurting people, but not really understand what is the whole system and how did we get here and where are we going. And so that's really what this is about. So I'm going to start talking about what LNG is, where it comes from, and where it goes. Next, please, Jesse. So liquefied natural gas. Natural gas is a hydrocarbon, like oil is a hydrocarbon. They are different. They come from different parts of the earth, and they are not exactly the same thing. And I'll get into that on the next slide. Natural gas is actually made up of a number of hydrocarbons and other molecules. Depending on where it comes from, it can be 80 to 90% methane. So that's where you hear methane gas. But it also has other components like ethane, propane, butane, several other elements, including carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. Naturally, natural gas is odorless when it comes up out of the ground, and it is normally in a gaseous state. So liquefied natural gas is a super cooled flow of natural gas to turn it into a liquid, because you have to get it very cold and keep it at high pressure in order for it to liquefy so you can move it around. And that liquefaction process happens between when it's pulled out of the ground and when it's put in a pipeline for transport, for use either as energy or for industrial processes. And that's where you get into this, the issue also of natural gas liquids, or NGLs, not to be confused with LNG. These are all coming out of the same stream out of the ground, but they are separated out in industrial processes. They go through refinement, they go through fractionation, they go through liquefaction in order to be moved around. And those natural gas liquids are frequently what's used for industrial production. That's ethane and propane and butane, all those other things that are in the stream can be used for industrial production. And then the liquid natural gas itself is predominantly used for energy. So the methane portion of LNG is predominantly used for various forms of heating, of industrial energy. So, you can't, well, mostly LNG is not used for combustion in the way that oil is, but it is used to produce electricity, energy, and heat. Okay, next slide. So talking a bit about the difference between oil and natural gas, as most of us are familiar with at this point, fossil gases, natural gas and petroleum are both hydrocarbons found under the ground after millions of years of animal fossils layered under the sediment and water, really put pressure on and condensed these carbon-based life forms into fossil fuel, into hydrocarbons that can be used as fuels. The uses for oil and gas, as I mentioned, are not perfectly identical, though the companies that drill for one are often the companies that drill for the other. That's not always true, but especially your big multinational companies like Exxon and Shell and some of the others are dealing with both oil and natural gas. And as you can see on the right of this slide, natural gas has a simpler molecular structure than oil. So what you're just looking at is that's what a molecule of crude, a representative molecule of crude oil looks like compared to a representative molecule of methane. And you can see that methane is less complicated, which means it's less energy intensive to separate it, to break it, to crack it for industrial production. Oil and gas are also concentrated in specific geologic formations. As we know, there are specific parts of the world and specific parts of the United States that actually have different concentrations of gas underground and of oil underground. Most oil wells are also gas wells, but not every gas well is an oil well. So we see that as we are drilling for oil and gas, we are coming up with different hydrocarbons. They have to be treated different ways. And even the exact chemical cocktail of what is in the stream that gets drilled up from the ground depends on where you're drilling it from. It depends on which fossils were there 300 to 400 million years ago. So there is some variation across localities. But what's important to remember is that LNG is found deep underground in what they call the shale formation, the formations of sediment and rock that are deep, deep underground. And those are concentrated in particular parts of the United States. Next slide. So what you're looking at here is where the shale formations are in the United States. So there are several shale formations you might have heard of, the Bakken up there near Canada, the Marcellus Shale in the Ohio River Valley and Appalachian region, the Haynesville Shale in Northwest Louisiana. That's one that we might be familiar with, especially if you talk to some of the folks in some of the parishes up there. The water's not so good up there because of the way that natural gas is brought up out of the ground. It sounds like a simple process. You just drill a well, you bring it up out of the ground. But actually the way LNG is brought up out of the ground is through a process called fracking. That is the injection at extremely high pressure, a slurry of water and chemicals into the shale formation to basically split the formation open and through that pressure, force the gas up out of the ground. That is happening in these shale formations all across the United States. And unfortunately, through a number of market mechanisms, there is an explosion, and that pun is intended, of new oil and gas extraction, and particularly gas extraction coming out of the Permian Basin. That's that brown area you see that's in West Texas and East New Mexico. And we're going to focus for a minute on the Permian Basin because the gas that is coming out of the Permian, the LNG that's coming out of the Permian that is coming through Louisiana, the LNG that is coming through Louisiana that is driving what you might have been hearing about new export terminals and new pipelines. Almost all of that is coming out of the Permian right now. Next slide. And what that looks like is that we have already seen the production growth out of the Permian in the last 6 years grow by 135%. The plan for the next 8 years is to grow that by another 50%. Now, I don't know if y'all have heard, but we're not supposed to be growing fossil fuel use if we're going to stay under 1.5 degrees warming. And we probably won't stay under 1.5 degrees warming, but staying under 2 degrees warming is better than not staying under 2 degrees warming. So what we have to be thinking about, what we need to be thinking about, and what we need to be investing in and driving policy around is lowering our fossil fuel extraction and dependency. And instead, what we see is not just an increase, it is an exponential, a massive increase in LNG, in fracking to get that LNG out of the ground, and in export, because that is where most of it is going. Since 2019, oil executives have been publicly acknowledging that every additional barrel of oil or ton of gas that comes out of the Permian has to be for export, because we are way past the United States's energy demands for LNG or our chemical and production demands for LNG. So what we see is that this stuff is being exported. Now, again, that word export, okay, we're doing international trade of LNG. What does that actually mean? Next slide. I mentioned that LNG is specifically liquefied natural gas, and the reason it's liquefied is for transport. So when we say that the Permian Basin has experienced a 135% growth, what we mean is pipelines. We are talking about massive new pipeline infrastructure coming out of the Permian to Houston for refining and processing, through Louisiana to the port of South Louisiana for processing and export. Some of it's going now to Corpus Christi. Some of it's going down to Mexico. These are massive. Look at the growth just from 2012 to today. We went from that one pipeline from the Permian to Houston. Now we have dozens of pipelines. And this is what we are facing in Louisiana. And of course, once it goes through the pipeline, it then has to go on a ship. And we're talking about a real big ship. Next slide. The shipping export lanes that go from the United States, they go mostly to Europe and to Asia. There are also shipping flows down to South America, but the vast majority of LNG that is exported from the United States is going to Europe and Asia. And they are putting that LNG, they are piping it down to massive export terminals, which James, I think, is going to talk about more. And then from those export terminals, the reason why they have to pipe it out so far to those terminals is because literally the ships are so big, they can't come further inland than that. They have had to create new classes of ships to move LNG globally. They used to have what were called very large crude carriers to move crude oil globally. They now have what are called, y'all, I wish I was kidding, dragon ships are what they call them. The massive carriers, diesel ships that are carrying LNG all over the world. And these are not short shipping paths. These are, look at that path that goes all the way around Africa. These are long, long shipping paths. And all of this, the burden of the pollution, of the export footprint is all being put on communities in Texas and Louisiana for the sake of export. We are being told that this is to meet the nation's energy supply or whatever the propaganda is. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of this stuff is being exported at our expense. Next slide. And I just wanted to talk through, like, okay, I've talked a bit about how LNG is used for energy, it's used for heat. I've talked, made reference to natural gas liquids, NGLs that come out of the natural gas or LNG stream. But let's take a minute to appreciate exactly what we are talking about here. Because the boom in fracking of LNG is driving not just increased use of LNG and use of methane gas in heating and electricity. It is driving a massive build out and explosion in new industrial production. We're talking about plastics, we're talking about fertilizers, we're talking about pesticides, we're talking about a myriad of toxic chemicals. And when you pull LNG out of the ground, in order to actually use it in any way, it has to go through a number of industrial processes. It has to be separated. It has to be processed to have all the extra stuff removed, to have the NGL separated from it. It's got to go to a compressor station. When it leaves the compressor station, you have to add odorant to it, because that's the other fun fact about LNG is that it's odorless when it first comes out of the ground. And oftentimes when it's in the pipelines out of the fracking space, it has no odor. It doesn't have odor added to it until it's starting to go to the local natural gas utility to run it to your home, which means if it's in the pipeline, it frequently doesn't have a smell. So the warning that we think that we all know to associate the smell of gas with gas oftentimes isn't there, because that is an intentionally added smell for safety in your home, but that doesn't necessarily apply to safety in a pipeline or at the actual wellhead if you unfortunately live near one of those. And then of course that LNG, the gas continues to flow to customers' houses, to industrial sites. And one of the major pieces of this flow is actually the issue of storage. because one of the things that the energy markets don't want to tell us about and don't want us talking about is that they have pulled too much gas out of the ground. They have pulled more gas out of the ground than they actually have a market for. So one of the things that they are doing right now is building massive new storage terminals, underground, above ground. In many cases, they're putting this stuff on ships, and then the ships are basically a de facto storage facility. This is happening all over the world. And the reason why they are pulling it out of the ground at such a clip is because they have the technology to do it, and they trust that at some point they'll be able to create the markets. But that's part of why for many years, the price of natural gas, as other folks are going to talk about, was so low. And that's not true anymore. The prices are pretty volatile now. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. But I just wanted to close out this portion with the next slide to show you just a glimpse. I know y'all can't read this. This is a portion of a diagram of the petrochemical supply chain. The two big gray boxes at the bottom are crude oil and natural gas, and everything else that comes out of that. It's methane, it's propane, it's ethane, it's naphtha, because you can pull ethane and propane out of oil too. Those NGLs are also in the oil. And from that, you get the entire poisonous tree. You get the benzenes, you get the propylenes, you get the ethylenes, and the ethylene sodas, and the ethylene glycols, and the polyethylenes, and the polyethylene terephtalates. There are so many petrochemicals that come out of this supply chain. Every single one of the branches on this chart is an industrial process that required energy, that required water, that required a permit, that almost certainly allowed that company to emit carcinogenic chemicals into the air near a community. That is what we are looking at when we are looking at this puzzle. This actually came from the plastics industry, and they're like, look at our beautiful supply chain, and we color coded it, and it's so nice. And what I see when I look at this chart is every one of those little branches, every single time you separated off one chemical from another, somebody got a permit from the government that is meant to be our representatives to permit them to put carcinogens into the air. And that is part of why we are talking about this, is not just the environmental impact, although the environmental impact is significant, but it is the human health impact of this stuff being in our neighborhoods, whether it's the wellhead or the plastics cracker or the fractionator. These things are not far away from people. Y'all, you can stand on top of the Capitol building in Baton Rouge, and Exxon is right there. Exxon's largest plastic plant is right off the property of the Baton Rouge State Capitol. The Baton Rouge State Capitol is surrounded by neighborhoods. This is what we are talking about right now. We are talking about both the exposure point that folks are facing in Louisiana of this refining process, of the pipelines, of the extraction of LNG. And we're also talking about the fact that when this stuff gets piped into our homes, whether it comes in through the gas line or it comes in through the groceries that we bring home, we are consistently exposed to toxic chemicals that are documented to be harmful to our health. And yet we are faced with propaganda all the time that these chemicals are fine, that the gas is fine, that the plastics are fine. And that is propaganda. I don't use that word lightly. That is marketing by the oil and gas industries with complicity and support from our governments to make us believe that these products are safe, and they are not. And with that, I think James, or who's going after me? And maybe I'll hand it back to Jesse.
Yeah, James is up next.
Yeah, it's my turn. Thank you so much, Jane. You really hit it on. So good. Beyond the environmental and the health concerns and caring for your neighbor, the main issue we're seeing today in this last 6 months really is the price of methane has gone through the roof. This natural gas price, because of this Ukrainian crisis, and also because of America's ability now to export gas liquefied natural gas. We see that the price has gone through the roof. This is, I'm gonna go through a few real boring charts here, so bear with me. These are all from the Energy Information Administration. This is what you can see on the screen now is the, over the last 40 years, what the natural gas consumption has been in the United States. So you can see it's pretty much flat. It has gone up about 10,000 billion cubic feet, which is a huge amount. But overall, it's not that much. So you can see from 2015 to 2021 is the area I'm really gonna focus on. If you could go to the next slide there. So our natural gas consumption is basically flat between 2015 and 2021. The production has also been flat up to 2015. And then as you can see, it escalated once we started fracking all these areas like Jane was talking about. So you can see the production, we've made more than we need starting in about 2015. If you go to the next slide. This is the chart that really speaks volumes here. If you can see, this tells you exactly why the price of electricity and natural gas is through the roof. Not only are we producing more, but we are exporting even more than we need to. If you could go to the next slide. If you see from 2015 to 2021, there's a huge amount of exports going on. Here's another good chart. I got this from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. As you can see, from 2002 until 2022, the home and business use of this natural gas has actually gone down. Industry use of natural gas has gone down. The electricity generated from natural gas in America has gone down. So you would think that the price should also go down. But what we see here is that we're actually exporting by pipeline to Canada and to Mexico mainly. And the natural gas, liquefied natural gas is what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years that has really driven the price up. The slide says that there are 7. There's actually 8 different gas export terminals now in the United States. 3 of them are here in Southwest Louisiana, operating. The largest gas export terminal in the world is on the Sabine River, right at the border with Texas. Cheniere Sabine Pass is an absolutely massive facility built right on the coast, where they freeze this gas to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit in order to put it on these ships and mainly send it to Asia. If you could go to the next slide, please, Jesse. This is why we're exporting this gas, and this is why your price has gone up so much. In January of 21, the price of gas on the market was about $2. In January of 22 is about $4. And in June, really, it's over $9. And so that increase is caused by being tied to a global market. You can see on this slide that because the price in the UK in June of 21 was $9 to have it delivered and then this year, right before the invasion of Ukraine, the price is 28. The actual price today is about $40 per million BTU to have it delivered in Europe. And the price of the gas has only gone up about half of that. So what's happening here is that there's a huge demand in Asia and in Europe where they cannot get this gas. And because we have these gas export terminals, we are tied to the volatility of this global market. The problem that we really have is that we currently have 8 export terminals, but that's not enough. These big gas companies really want to put over 20 different terminals along the Gulf Coast. If you could go to the next slide. Here's a little breakdown of the price. This is called at the Henry Hub, which is a terminal here just in South Louisiana where natural gas is priced. As you can see, from 2009 up until last year, the price for us, the price to buy natural gas hovered under $5. This year, after this invasion, and because we are able to export, because we have all of these terminals, the price shot up. And that was because the huge demand overseas caused volatility in our domestic market. If you notice on your electricity bill, I'm sure that May and June and July are probably some of the highest electricity you've ever paid ever. And that not only because of the storms in South Louisiana, but also because of this being tied to this global market. There are no guardrails, there are no caps on how much these terminals are allowed to export. The Department of Energy, along with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, have declared that this is in the public interest, that exporting natural gas is in our public interest. I think if you would look at your gas bill, your electricity bill, you see it's not in your interest, and you are the public. Why are we having to turn over all of this this redistribution of wealth from every single person, especially the most low income and fixed and marginalized people are giving money over to pay for this gas? And if you go back one slide, Jesse, please. Yeah, if you see, it's not, we're not helping anybody except profiting the companies that own these terminals and have been fracking this gas. So not only is it terrible for the environment, not only is it very harmful for the health and the well-being of people who live alongside these facilities, it's also sending up massive amounts of greenhouse gases, which are exacerbating climate change, continuing to see these crazy, more frequent storms, wildfires, droughts and floods at the same time, and rivers going dry in Europe. It's really crazy that we're going to continue down a path that we already know what's going to happen if we do that, and it's costing us through the nose to do it. If you could go forward again, yeah. So let's just want to speak to how many terminals are actually here. If you can see, there's a large concentration in the Gulf. These are the ones that already exist. So here in Southwest Louisiana, we have 3 terminals. Corpus Christi has one. There's also one in Freeport, Texas. The plan for, go forward one slide. This is the plan, and these are the ones that have already been permitted. They already have secured permits from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So if we're exporting 1/5 of the natural gas that's produced already in this country, and they want to build all of these that are already permitted, that haven't been built yet, if we're going to do that, we will see that our natural gas is not just 20% of what is being exported. It'll end up being over 50%. And so if your gas bills, if your electricity bills are so high now, being tied to this global market will really be exacerbated, and the bills will be, I mean, I can't even imagine how high it will end up being without some kind of guardrail, without some kind of cap on there. If you could go forward again. I just want to give you a good picture of what we're talking about. This is one of the facilities that's right at the mouth of the Calcasieu River here in Southwest Louisiana. This is Venture Global's Calcasieu Pass facility. It's the newest one to have been built. As you can see, there's a huge flare that has roared for over 91 days. They call them dragon ships, but these are also dragon terminals. They not only do they belch fire and smoke and toxic gases, a lot of times it's not completely consumed. And so what we see is more hydrocarbons, formaldehydes, other carcinogens are being emitted into the air, loosely regulated. And for what? This terminal here does nothing for the American public whatsoever except raise your electricity bill, because the only point of having gas export terminals is to liquefy the gas and then to export it. It doesn't supply any power to any of those facilities, any of those houses in the background. It doesn't supply any gas to any or any other thing to anybody in the area here. Its only purpose is to liquefy and export this natural gas. If you can go to the next slide. This is another terminal. This is Cameron LNG, which is located in Hackberry. As you can see, where they're placing these, not only does it affect the environment and the health and the cost, it also is affecting the wildlife in ways that we have not even really begun to understand because they put these up so quickly. I think that's it for me. You go one more slide. I think that was it. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Zach. Thank y'all so much. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer some later. Thanks.
Cool, y'all. I see myself. How do I stop that? Okay, I guess I'm just gonna have to deal with it. All right. I've already introduced myself, so we'll move on to the next slide. Thanks, y'all. And this is probably a refresher. Negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit to make the natural gas 600 times smaller and able to export. I mean, clip through. I think there's some animation where the text will come up. Okay, yeah, so we've talked about a lot of this stuff, but I'll just mention the one thing that hasn't come up already. Deep water ports. There's also there can be deep water LNG export terminals as well. FLNG stands for floating LNG, and so that's another thing that organizations like the Sierra Club and Bucket Brigade and others are keeping an eye out for. Another way that the LNG fossil fuel industry can try to exploit some different loopholes and weaknesses in our environmental regulations, and try to build these things more quickly, because they're actually racing each other. All these things, you know, there's different companies that are competing with each other to get to the market first, and so they're trying to build these things really quickly. We can keep going. That's from Healthy Gulf. So shout out to them. Sorry, Scott couldn't be here today. I borrowed this one from Healthy Gulf, and Naomi Yoder over there as well. We can keep going. Just another angle showing you some of the stuff that James was just showing you. But I think some of the things that James was showing was more focused on the ships. And I think this one's interesting. I believe this is Sabine Pass, if I remember right. I took the picture. So what's interesting here, and James explained this to me, he was there with me, is how much infrastructure is required to cool this stuff. So this is hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of acres. I'm not the kind of person that looks at the permits and looks at those numbers, but yeah, James says these are called refrigerant trains. And so it's a giant refrigerator is how James described it to me. And we know our refrigerators use a decent amount of energy in our homes, but if you imagine hundreds of football fields full of refrigerators, those refrigerators themselves, the refrigerants themselves are also petrochemicals. And you have to use a lot of that gas to power this facility. So you end up losing 10 or more % of all that gas in the process of cooling it to ship it. So it's actually extremely inefficient. And that's another factor that drives up some of our costs, as well as the environmental impacts, of course. We can go to the next slide. James already showed you this. I think his graphics were really effective at that, but you can see that the Gulf Coast is really targeted for these LNG facilities. You can also see, I think, the other image that showed the pipelines didn't get all the way down to Brownsville, Texas, down there on the Mexican border. And just for an economic justice perspective on this, the Brownsville area is one of the poorest areas in the entire United States. And it's also been taken over in many ways by SpaceX, by Elon Musk's hobby, aerospace thing, which is having massive impacts on their environment and indigenous lands and endangered species there. And so that's just to mention that these things all compound when we're looking at environmental and economic justice. And I'll mention a little bit about the jobs and taxes and those sorts of things that are other costs that are associated with LNG in just a minute. We can go to the next slide. And I'd like to talk about sacrifice zones just a little bit. It's related to what I was just saying, that there's these compounding layers of harm that come to communities that oftentimes they've already been the target of the petrochemical industry or oil refining, all these kinds of things. And LNG is another layer on top of that. And as James pointed out, these corporations are making millions and billions of dollars off of these things. And meanwhile, this is my colleague in the bottom left, Jesse Parfait, who's in Baton Rouge and is a campaign representative working on LNG in Southeast Louisiana for the Sierra Club. repairing her parents' roof after Hurricane Ida. And so I know that hurricane season is on all of our minds here in Louisiana. And, when we're left rebuilding constantly over and over again, I remember this in North Carolina too, where I used to live. The costs, these aren't the costs that are getting counted when James is talking about the government deciding if this is in the public interest. So you can see how close these things are in people's neighborhoods, to where people recreate, to where people live. And every time we have to rebuild from a hurricane, that's a cost on us. That makes it harder for us to afford our energy and to have a basic standard of living, as well as the pollution is another cost. So I'll go to the next slide. Thank you. Speaking of environmental costs, we can click through this one a bit. Put the text up there. These are things that we pay for as Louisiana residents, trying to rebuild our wetlands. And if you speak to John Allaire, a resident down in Cameron Parish, who lives next to an existing LNG facility, and his land is the target of several more, he would be losing a ton of the wetlands that are not only incredibly biodiverse, he also has cheniers, the slightly elevated bits of land with trees and foliage on our coastlines that are critical to hurricane protection. And so these wetlands and these cheniers, we've got to rebuild them. We're trying to. We're putting $2 billion into the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion, which I'm sure many of you all know about. So why on earth are we, Louisiana state officials, federal officials, local officials in some cases, allowing the destruction of thousands more acres of these wetlands to build LNG terminals that, as James and Jane already pointed out, are not necessary for us. They're only benefiting corporations. And you can actually calculate the cost of the greenhouse gas emissions from a facility like Driftwood LNG in Southwest Louisiana, over $322 million in public health costs per year, according to the EPA. And I'm sure y'all can think of other ways that greenhouse gases, the loss of wetlands, and other forms of destruction from fossil fuel development, specifically LNG, are costing you. And that all adds up. Those are things that make it harder for us to pay our bills and to live good lives here. Next slide, please. I mentioned cumulative impact a little bit. There's some fossil fuel facilities in Port Arthur, Texas. Photo I took, it's from a bus, we're moving pretty quickly. But yeah, reiterating the point I just made, the sum total impact of climate change, air and water pollution, public health, and wetlands loss, and then factoring on all the other fossil fuel and petrochemicals, as Jane and James explained so eloquently. Y'all live in Louisiana or have familiarity with Louisiana here, I believe, or places like Port Arthur, Texas, that are just overrun with fossil fuel development. And I hear people say pretty often, if you think that we can take more of this stuff down here, come and try to live in it for a little bit, and then let us know if that's something you would like to live next to. And James and some others with Louisiana Bucket Brigade, also Rashida Ozan from Healthy Gulf, have been going up to Rehoboth Beach, which is I believe in Delaware, right, James? It's a place that Joe Biden likes to vacation, and asking that same question, would you allow this kind of thing to happen to your beloved places? And I think the answer is no. I'll go to the next slide. I'll get into the energy prices here. $700, not an unheard of bill. And so these LNG exports are costing us. And you can see this little thing about the war in Ukraine. But I guess it hasn't really been said just yet. In terms of war in Ukraine and demand for gas in Europe, the facilities that we've already built, that are already built in the US, many of them on the Gulf Coast primarily, are already meeting that increased demand. They've started putting out far more gas than they already had, many times more. And so, like James was saying, we're building all this stuff, which will take years and years to develop, not actually to respond to the current moment in Europe. I think, like Jane said, that's actually understanding that the word propaganda is a strong word, but that's propaganda. It's not something that these facilities are in any position to actually make a difference on. But they will lock us in to decades and decades more of dependence on this stuff, because these are very expensive facilities, and the companies are going to want to get their money's worth out of it. They're not going to want to leave these facilities stranded. And so one of the good things about that is that one of the places where we've had success as the climate movement is convincing banks not to put their money into these facilities, because it's an investment and they stand to potentially not get their money back as the world moves beyond fossil fuels. And so James has already talked about the price of gas here since the beginning of the US fracking boom. But what's really interesting here is this little thing off to the right of the chart where there's a circle. So just notice there that that line actually dips quite a bit. It was at 950. This is a few months ago. I think this was in maybe May or June, if I'm remembering correctly, where there's this dip, and I'll explain why that happened, why the price went down several dollars momentarily. You can go to the next slide. So household inflation is directly related to gas prices. It's used for heating, electricity, and cooking. So our electricity prices in the Southeast are projected to be almost double last year. I'm sure you're already seeing that. I have level billing with Entergy, so it's a little deceptive. They're averaging out my last 12 bills, but they're already going up, and I'm using the same or less energy that I used last year. One of the things I think is important, as I mentioned, heating, electricity, and cooking. Sometimes I think that when I'm using gas, it's my stove, it's my oven, it's my water heater. I have a gas water heater. I have a gas dryer in my home. But I think of all the other electricity, the air conditioning and that kind of stuff during the summer not being gas. Actually, about 80% of our electricity in Louisiana comes from methane gas-fired power plants. And so all of our energy prices are driven by gas, not just the ones where we're actually burning that gas in our home. And high gas prices affects food prices. That's something that Jane was kind of mentioning, all the industrial things that go into this. And so industrial agriculture is extremely reliant on ammonia to fertilize the soil, and those costs have risen a lot. And so that's a big factor in our food costs that we're seeing in grocery stores these days. Next slide, please. Okay, so getting back to that dip in energy, in LNG and household gas prices. In a couple months ago, I apologize, I don't remember the exact date of this, but there was an explosion at an existing LNG facility in Freeport, Texas, just south of Houston. And that one facility not being able to export LNG to other countries away from our domestic market, the gas prices dropped 16% that day because that gas had to stay in the United States, and then we could use it. And therefore, there was more supply to meet our demand, and our prices went down. And that facility, because of safety concerns, is still offline right now. The prices have gone back up somewhat, but we're noticing that there's actually a direct tie, as James pointed out, between LNG and gas prices. The more we export, the more our prices are going to go up here. And that's a simple one-to-one correlation. Next slide, please. Okay, we're reiterating as Jane said we would. So I guess that's what happens when you go last. But profits are up. I think that's one to really take home with you and tell your neighbors and spread the word that this is all about profits for the fossil fuel industry. top 21 oil and gas companies in the first quarter of 2022 made over $40 billion in profits. It's going to investors, it's not going to us. And those high energy prices affect low-income Americans the most. As anyone from Alliance for Affordable Energy can tell you, energy burden's a real thing, especially in Louisiana, where we're so reliant in our energy grid on methane gas for our energy. When we're tied to these volatile global markets, our prices go way up, and these things aren't really boosting our economy at all. It's just going into corporations' pockets, and then we're left with higher bills. And one thing I wanted to mention, since I was talking about the grid being pretty dirty and expensive here, another person from Alliance for Affordable Energy who I give a little shout out to is Yvonne Capel-Vickery, who's working on improving our grid and getting power lines out to where we can bring in wind energy from offshore, and we can bring more clean energy onto our grid. So there's a lot of work that we can do there. That's one of the solutions that's available to us. Is clean energy is the cheapest form of energy available to us if we would invest in it. And our utilities don't have much of an incentive to. They like to build big things. That's where they get their profits from. And if we can get the energy in our hands, tell them what kind of energy we want, have energy democracy, like we were talking about at a rally that the Alliance led maybe 2 weeks ago now in New Orleans, making Entergy New Orleans a public utility. So they don't have that profit incentive, and they're going to serve us. So those are a couple of the solutions that groups like ours presenting here are a part of, and I really encourage y'all to get on our lists, come out to our meetings, spend time with us if you don't already. I know many of y'all already do, and I think that's the best way that we can move forward, is to have your ideas and your energy. Okay, next slide. I just mentioned local jobs. You can see the areas we've been talking about where there's the most fossil fuel infrastructure. See these red dots. Many of them are also the poorest places in Texas. And I'll talk about Louisiana on the next slide, please. Oh, my bad. I think I've talked about the environmental value a bit, but this picture, both these pictures are actually from John O'Leary's place in Cameron Parish, Louisiana, who I already mentioned is next to these LNG facilities. And I mentioned the biodiversity. That has an economic value. You see people bird watching. It's an important aspect of that is animals with Louisiana Bucket Brigade, the director, and she's in New Orleans. Good eye, Robert. And fishing, crabbing, shrimping, all these things are so important not only to our way of life, but also to our economy. And so as we lose those things, we lose the ability to afford the costs that come along with LNG. Next slide, please. All right, here's where I was trying to get to. Yeah. Corporate giveaways. I'm sure many people in Louisiana are aware of ITEP, the Industrial Tax Exemption Program that allows facilities like Cameron LNG to pay 0.01% of the total taxes that they could be paying to Cameron Parish and to the state of Louisiana. So no wonder Cameron Parish has a rapidly decreasing population, has a population that's more sick than the average, like 80th percentile in terms of cancer risk for the country, for education and for income. All of these metrics, Cameron Parish is behind, and they have all of this $11.7 billion property that they should be getting value out of, and they're not. And that's just part of how this industry operates. And if they tell you otherwise, then they're not being really very honest with you. And the source for that is Together Louisiana, another group that you should support and get involved in if these questions concern you. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I see Kendall talking about blue hydrogen as well. That could be a good question to discuss later. I know Kendall's got a lot of expertise there. So we're looking at Calcasieu and Cameron Parish here. I circled those because They are number 1 and 2, if you see on this column towards the left, in terms of how much they give away in terms of property taxes. And then what they get for that. Calcasieu Parish, they gave away $4 billion for the loss of 5,500 jobs. The ITEP program does not require these businesses to create jobs. So it's an incredibly broken program, and it's really hurting Louisiana. And we can see that in each of these places. Next slide, please. In Baton Rouge, that amount of foregone tax revenue could pay for a raise of $9,000 or fully fund universal pre-K. And those are things that have economic value. Those are things that keep people in our communities. People spend money in their communities. Corporations don't spend money in our communities. They send that money out elsewhere. Our teachers having more money, they're going to put that back into our communities. So that's just one example. And you can see all the other types of things that could go into as well. Next slide, please. I'm just about done. Thanks, y'all. These are subsidies in millions of dollars since 2010 to 2020 for different forms of energy. And you can see the oil and gas gets a lot of subsidies. And this is in Texas. This is in the state of Texas. So you can see that's a factor there as well. ITEP isn't the only way that these businesses find a way to extract profit from our communities. There's also government subsidies. Next slide, please. Okay, last slide. I'm an organizer. I'm not a technical expert or any of this kind of stuff, though I have to know this information. But we can change this narrative around what's happening with our gas, what it's costing us. Those are things that we have the power to change through using the media, through demonstrations, through things like I talked about with Alliance for Affordable Energy. That wound up in the paper. It built relationships between people that we're going to be able to use going forward to continue to mount a defense against the attacks that are coming at us from the fossil fuel industry and from our utilities. And so I could, as we're thinking about economic justice, the things that we want in our communities is one I mentioned earlier as I was talking about my background in Appalachia. One of the most important things is not just getting rid of some of these bad things, but it's what do we want. And so I just encourage everyone to think about, if we didn't have these fossil fuel facilities in our communities and it was up to you, is that what you would choose or what would you choose? What are the things that we can plant seeds for? This transition isn't going to happen overnight. And I think we get scared sometimes when the fossil fuel industry sort of threatens that they could remove their jobs. We're not ready. We don't have all the infrastructure of clean energy just yet. We don't have all the electric vehicles. It's going to be decades long, but there's a ton of stuff that we can be starting right now, that there are opportunities to be doing right now, like I was mentioning with Yvonne, and building transmission lines that can support a clean energy future. And there's so much more too that we can be doing in our own communities on a small scale and demonstrating what the future could look like at a large scale. So that's all about coming together. We have great organizations here in our communities and great people who have this vision. We're doing great things, like Together Louisiana is building storm resilient or making houses of worship storm resilient. Feed the Second Line in New Orleans is making restaurants resilient to hurricanes and being able to continue feeding people during hurricanes and disasters. These are things I'm really, really excited about, and I think point the way to the fact that we, in the communities that are most affected by fossil fuels, we have the solutions for what the world can look like beyond fossil fuels. So that's my suggestion. I could tell you all about things that you can comment on, things you can send to FEMA, or not to FEMA, to FERC, to the Department of Energy. There's lots of comment periods, and our organizations keep you posted on how to submit your comments and do those kinds of things. But the most important thing is organizing. It's about people. And so I really encourage y'all, if you can, to spend some time with the organizations here and the organizations that are in your community. And that wraps up my presentation. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to real briefly just breeze through this, how the price of methane affects your utility bill presentation. It's just going to be kind of a deeper dive into the specifics of how all of this economic stuff we've been talking about affects you as a ratepayer of a utility. So for first, the obvious. So if you actually have gas service to your home, if you have a gas heater or gas range and oven, then you'll have a gas charge portion of your bill from your utility. This comes from Entergy's website on their portion about understanding your bill. And you see right here in the highlighted portion, it's pretty straightforward formula. This sample bill they give shows 112, that's CCF stands for 100 cubic feet. So that's a measure of volume of gas that was used for this month times 45 or 50 cents per unit. And then you get your total there to the right. So that's pretty straightforward, a pass through of that cost of fuel. Though I would add, that our dependence on natural gas also means that you're paying into that above charge, the gas base rate charge, which is infrastructure and all of the stuff that goes to supporting and getting that gas to your home. So as long as we're relying on natural gas, we're also paying for the infrastructure as well, not just the fuel itself. But even if you don't have gas service at your home, you see here, this chart shows both the average for the United States and the Louisiana power generation fuel mix. And this has been touched on briefly already, but you'll see here over 70% of our power generation, our electricity generation in Louisiana comes from the burning of methane versus you see 45% nationally, which means that that cost gets passed through straight to you. The utility is certainly not paying for the cost of that fuel. They're going to pass it to you, the consumer. And that comes to you in a couple of different ways. One of which is through the purchase power cost recovery rider. So you see that there, the top portion of the highlighted section. And what that is long-term purchase power agreements that Entergy enters into to procure power that they're not able to generate themselves. The line below that is the fuel charge and purchase power cost. So this is a direct pass through of the natural gas that is being burned to produce the electricity that you're consuming in your home. So again, that cost is passed through directly to you, as well as the cost of other purchase power costs that they have for, unexpected outages and that sort of thing that have to be purchased off the market, which are largely natural gas generation. So you see here, this is a chart that demonstrates the electric fuel adjustment charge. This is just for Entergy New Orleans. And you see the highlighted section shows how that charge has changed over the course of this year. And you see that it's more than tripled over the course of the year so far as the cost of natural gas has risen. Another fun chart for you, and you may have some difficulty reading this, but what it shows is a comparison of all of the electric utilities within the jurisdiction of the Louisiana Public Service Commission and how the cost of fuel affects electric rates versus, from month to month and year to year. So if you see the grayish blue bar is for the current month, which this chart shows the month of July 2022. And then you see the previous month in green, and then the same month last year is the dark colored bar. And the reason I included this chart is to show the extreme volatility of gas prices, which has been talked about by other panelists. But for ratepayers, electric residential ratepayers, what it means is that it makes it very difficult to predict what your bill is going to be from month to month and year to year because of these wild swings in the cost of methane. So we mentioned already, unexpected outages and having to purchase power off the market that is largely based in methane generation. Well, why does that happen? Well, for instance, this headline comes from today's NOLA.com. If you paid attention to the New Orleans City Council's joint meeting of the Utility and Climate and Sustainability Committees yesterday, you heard about the recent outage of the Grand Gulf Nuclear Station in Mississippi, which is costing us $10.2 million just for the past few weeks that it's been out. A lot of that cost has to do with the fact that we're having to make up for the power that the plant should be producing by purchasing it from the market. And again, all of that cost gets passed on to ratepayers. So Zach talked about how, recently methane prices have reached $9 per MMBTU, which is the highest price we've seen in over a decade. The red asterisk here is the spot price for methane as of about 11:30 this morning when I made this slide. It was trading at about $7.87, which is actually lower than the past couple of months. It's been closer to $9. This chart comes from the Integrated Resource Plan for Entergy New Orleans, the most recent integrated resource plan. And what an integrated resource plan is the plan that a utility comes up with every 3 to 5 years of how it's going to meet customer demand in the most economic way. And so what this chart, why I included it, is to show that if you look at the cost of natural gas as Entergy New Orleans is forecasting it, you see that they're looking at costs of $2 to $4 for the current year, when we know that it's actually up where that red asterisk is at $7.87 or even above that. If you look to the right of the chart, you see that the $9 price that we've seen recently isn't even on this chart. So Entergy does not expect to be paying that price for gas until well beyond 2040, but we're actually seeing those prices today. So that shows you that, in their planning going forward, they have a very rosy picture of what the price of natural gas is going to be. And the reason that affects you is because even though in this particular round of planning, with these natural gas prices, Entergy says that they're not forecasting the need for any new fossil fuel generation. It does affect the retirement of existing natural gas resources. So it means that we will continue to rely on existing natural gas infrastructure so long as we have these unrealistically low prices for natural gas reflected in our forecasting. And that is the end of my slides. We have about 16 minutes and change left in our time. So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for questions at this time. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll call on you in that order. And I see that, let's see.
Can I go ahead and answer one of Kendall's questions in the chat before we go to the hands raised?
Yeah, go ahead, Jane,
Yeah.
and then I'll call on if their hands raised.
The oil and gas markets, as Kendall is alluding to here, are very complicated, and they are extremely difficult to understand, especially for folks who don't think about markets all the time. I have probably learned this multiple times and still have trouble explaining it. And so I'm hoping that folks will definitely weigh in here. There are commodities markets. There are basically markets that are staffed and managed by brokers that buy all of the LNG and oil for export and then sell it on. They're middlemen, middle people between the folks who pull the oil and gas out of the ground and the actual utilities and governments and industries that buy the gas as feedstock. Some companies are what's called vertically integrated, which means they control all the way from the wellhead to the end industrial process or to the end utility process. But for the most part, most of the oil and gas in the world is sold on commodity markets rather than sold directly from seller to buyer, as we normally think of markets. That makes things a lot more complicated. That means that those brokers actually have a lot more hand in setting the price and controlling the supply, because it's not a lot of companies who might have different supplies. It's different commodities markets. And then you have at play different organizations like OPEC, the oil producing something countries. Now I forget what the E stands for. And you have the sort of alliances of countries that are also determining supply and making internal commitments. None of it is legally binding, but commitments to produce or not produce certain amounts of oil and gas. And so one of the ways that we've actually seen the price of oil and gas fluctuate over, thank you, Jesse. One of the ways that we've actually seen the price of oil and gas fluctuate over the last couple of years is, the Russian aggression in Ukraine is one, sanctions is one, but we've actually seen countries intentionally what they call flooding the market with supply in order to affect the price in trade wars that happen. This is actually happening at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's one of the reasons why gas prices plummeted to negative prices, which means for a small amount of moment, and I think that was actually oil, but for a small amount of time, oil was more expensive to store than it was to actually sell on the market because the price was negative. And the reason that happened was because of a geopolitical dispute between Saudi Arabia and Russia and the US over shipping supply lanes. And so these are all really complicated things that feed into the price of oil and gas. And we can sort of look at this elephant from many angles, but seeing the whole elephant of the market is actually really quite difficult.
Thank you, Jane. Lane?
There. I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to be piggy, so I'm just going to ask one. Maybe there'll be time for the others. First of all, is a link to this recording? I know you said you're going to share the slides, but will we be able to get somehow to a link that so we can rewatch this? This is incredibly dense. Thank you. That's not my question. I guess the question that I most want to ask is, there was a little bit of confusion for me. We started off by hearing that when gas comes out of the ground, it's gaseous, and it has to be converted to LNG so that it can be shipped, so that it can be transported, all of that. But then I felt like I was hearing you talking about LNG being produced, at wellheads. And I feel like the confusion, at least in my head, it may have to do with fracking. I'm not sure, but I guess my question is almost all of the new gas production in the United States fracked? Is that true?
Yes, for gas. And I see James and I both wanting to answer this question, and that's good. So natural gas comes out of the wellhead. The gaseous stream that is a mix of methane and ethane and propane and butane and some other, carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide and other things that come up out of the shale, that natural gas is produced at the wellhead. And by produced, we just mean it is pulled up out of the ground. That's what we mean when we say produced in that sense. It then has to be liquefied. It has to be put at extremely low temperature and very high pressure in order to be transported through the pipeline. And so
Anyway.
that's when I'll hand it to James to explain like the refrigerants and how that process works.
Yeah, I guess what I was really, it's gas, it's in a gas state the entire time it's in the pipeline until it gets to the terminal. And these huge refrigerators are at the gas export terminals. That's why they take up so much land. And so it's actually in a gas state, which one every 3 days explodes somewhere in the country, which is terrifying. But it's in a gas state all the way to these terminals, and then at these terminals where it is super cooled and turned into a liquid state at -260. So yeah, from the wellhead through the pipelines, through the compressor stations, all the way until these final export terminals where they're refrigerated and frozen. All of that is like the natural gas that is in a gaseous state that is highly combustible, and we see problems with all the time. Hope that answered it a little bit.
It does, and I'm just going to have to pull back. I've got a lot of other questions, but I'll just shut up now.
Yvonne?
Hey, yeah, my question is about the Henry Hub prices. So Entergy in their meetings in their meetings of council, they'll often just like be like, well, the Henry Hub prices are high. So like, blah, there's nothing we can do about it. And I was wondering if maybe one of y'all could explain how that price is determined and like what that means, the Henry Hub price.
I can take the Henry Hub is a location of just south of Eunice over here in Southwest Louisiana. It is the price is basically the standard price of gas, depending on where it comes, just like we were talking about Bakken crude and Permian crude and gas. All of these different things have different properties and are different qualities and different prices. But the standard price in the US is this Henry Hub price. And so what sets the price is, like we just said, was the market, and being tied to this global market now with these gas export terminals makes it so that these volatile global forces are now being felt in the domestic prices felt at the Henry Hub, which is the standard location for natural gas prices. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna like say it back so that I see if I understand this. So basically, in Eunice, is it a like an office of people that are like calculating the price, or is it like it's a plant? Is it a facility?
No, that's just what it's called, because that is the place, the Henry Hub place. It's not like there's an office there that's calculating it. Global crude oil prices is usually Brent crude is the standard grade. When they say the Brent crude price is this, that's the same thing. It's just calling the quality and the gas, so you can have a standard. So all gas is a little different, and so the Henry Hub is the standard American Southern. I hope that I just rambled through that one, but hope that's a little clearer. Maybe somebody else could speak to it.
Miss Catherine?
I was going to ask almost the same question she was going to ask, but if the fracking is going on and they're pumping all of this stuff out of Louisiana and Texas, and it's going towards the Henry Hub, why is that going there? And then energy is turning around. All of the gas is leaving out of here. Everything is leaving out of here. Nothing for us. And then they're going to charge us all these prices? am I saying that right? Everything is going out, right? And then nothing staying in here for us, right? And then energy is setting in Henry Hub or whoever is setting these prices for us.
Well, I can take that just a little bit. Out of the total natural gas availability, the amount of gas that is here in the US, about 20% of it is being exported. And so 80% is here for us to use. But because 5 years ago, it was about 95% of the natural gas was for us to use. So because they've increased exports, they've taken that out of our supply. And so our supply is smaller and it costs more to get to our gas. It's not that energy, this is much bigger than just energy. Energy buys it from these suppliers, from the producers, and these gas companies. It's basically, and the Henry Hub it looks like it's super confusing. I'm glad Jane put that link in there. It's really like dollar bills. Like if you're going to trade something, you're going to pay in dollar bills. It is just the going price. Like if you have to, hope that's a little more helpful. It's not that all the gas goes through the Henry Hub or that's even where your gas is coming from. It's just that is the market standard
So
that's being used.
They're stealing from us and giving it to somebody else, because it used to be the 90%, right? Now they're taking it and giving it to somebody else, and we got to pay more for our utilities.
That's a good way to put it, but what really is happening is somebody is willing to pay more than us. And so because somebody's willing to pay more than us, they're going to go get the more money. They're going to get whoever the highest bidder is. Because we are now tied to this global market, they're going to go get the most money they can. And and because right now it's in Asia and Europe and not here, that's taking us, making us have to pay more.
That's inhuman, and it's an injustice. That's an environmental injustice to me.
I agree. It's an environmental and an economic injustice for every person in America, really. So, yes.
And I know we only have a few minutes left here and we don't have any more specific questions, although I feel like we all have a lot of questions, including about what Henry Hub is and why it's the de facto pricing mechanism. On some level, as James said, I just want to be clear that it's not, the Henry Hub has just been nominated. It has been given the right by the New York Mercantile Exchange, which is the commodities market. It has been given the right to set the price, basically. And it's because Louisiana and Texas are so central to the nation's gas and oil supplies that it's named after a central hub of oil and gas here, because it's one of the largest in the country. And so that, if not the largest. And so it's essentially almost by accident that it's called that. I see Sophie has a question, but I do also just want to hit on one other thing. One of the things that I was supposed to talk about in this is like alternatives. What are our alternatives? There's been a little bit of discussion so far on renewable energies, things like solar and wind. We've also been talking about the fact that LNG is going for export, right? So us adopting solar and wind for our own utilities might absolutely bring down the price of our utilities. It might absolutely help protect us from the emissions that come from oil and gas refining. And if this massive LNG system is set up for export to other countries, to Europe, to Asia, to other locations, we have to be thinking about an international, a global commitment to renewable energy that is for electrification. We also have to be thinking about the fact that some portion of this demand for gas and this demand for LNG is actually going not to electricity, it's going to consumer products. It's going to the production of methanol, it's going to the production of plastics, to the production of other consumer products, it's going to the production of pesticides and fertilizers. And some of that is domestic and some of that is for export. What we have to be doing in Louisiana and in Texas is pushing for both local and national and international changes to the systems that require industrial agriculture. We have to be talking about how we are building our food system around feeding people and not making money. We have to be talking about how we are building our fisheries system around feeding people, how we are building our electricity system around electrifying homes and ensuring that people have power, the power that they need to survive, and not about making as much money as possible. And that's part of the flaw, that is the flawed incentive and foundation of this system, is that we talk about these things as if they are public goods. That's where we use the word sort of propaganda. But actually what they are is commodities that make a very small amount of people a lot of money. And they should be commodities like public goods, and we should have access to them, and we should be able to live safely and live productively within the boundaries of the planet. But we're not doing that. So real alternatives. I wish y'all that I could tell you, like, get a solar panel and bring your own bag to the store. I will tell you that, get solar panels and bring your own bag to the store. And we have to be working to make sure that the food supply is as local as possible. And when it can't be local, then we figure out something that is not industrialized, that is not ravaging the soil, that we are advocating for these things at the local level, at the state level, at the national level. Just this past legislative session, there was a bill that actually made it through, one of our few exciting wins at the legislature, that was about soil health. And I know that doesn't sound like it's connected to LNG, but because so much of the LNG and the natural gas liquids are going to agriculture, that is relevant. So these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about food systems and incentives for them. And I just want to close out by saying they are using a lot of the public's money to pay for all this, as Jesse outlined, and it's being put back on the people. And we need to use the public's money for stuff that doesn't hurt us. We need to be using it for renewables and better food systems and international and national policy change, not for this system. So the subsidies are so important, as Zach was outlining, and we've got to change them.
Thank you, Jane. We are at time. I recognize that there might still be some questions, so I will hang around and answer any questions that I'm able to. I don't want to presume that the other speakers can stay, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. This was really fantastic. Thank you to Sophie for the tech assistance. The slides and the link to the recording will be available on our website. We'll push that out on social media, etc. And with that, I'll close it out. And like I said, I'll stick around if folks have other questions. Lane, I saw your hand up.
What I kind of don't get is, and this just may be coming at it from the wrong perspective. Would it be possible to what's the right word? Disconnect this oil, exporting business, which is so lucrative, to somehow disconnect that. And I'm talking about short-term solutions, obviously, to disconnect that from the national market. In other words, I mean, maybe it's not worth the candle to try to get that through, regulations and lobbying efforts by oil and gas companies. But it seems like if that's really where the profits are, that we're not benefiting from that at all, and in fact, it's hurting us. But could that be a short-term solution? Is to somehow, if people got angry enough to understand what's behind these huge increases in their bills?
100%. That's exactly I mean, we didn't export oil and gas until recently. I mean, there was an oil export ban. That was not in the short term. I mean, we've seen President Biden go ahead and promise even more gas exports because of the European crisis in the Ukraine. They are going to have a terrible situation this winter. I mean, that's going to happen, whether we export more or not. In the short term, I don't know what the real solution could be, and still have some geopolitical help our allies out in the short term. But none of these new proposals, none of these new facilities are going to be built in the short term anyway. So there's the Industrial Energy Consumers of America is a trade group of 11,000 different manufacturers in DC who is calling for a cap on exports, because every manufacturer in this country is suffering just like the consumers. So we're becoming disadvantaged to foreign manufacturers, the Chinese manufacturers who are not susceptible to these crazy increases, because they're all state-owned gas companies. So what's happening is more and more people need to speak out and need to contact the president, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I'll put a link in the chat. You can, it's something we were doing in Rehoboth Beach, but just send a letter is one way. And really, the more people understand that it's not Biden who's causing the prices, and it's not the Democrats or the Republicans who's causing the prices, it's just greed. It's just plain and simple maximizing profit, which is, that is a function of this capitalism that we are operating under. And so, it's not that we don't think people should make profits. They just should not be making profits on the backs of every single person in this country. I think that's the main point, to have some kind of cap to say, okay, you can have a 10% profit. You can't have a 500% profit.
Right.
That something like that, I think in the short term could happen, but it would take.
And we're not going to subsidize you anymore.
That's right. Well,
I don't understand why nobody has said, hey guys, you're making billions of dollars a month. There's no need for any subsidy here, and just cut it off and turn that money around to other good purposes like renewable energy. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm on my soapbox.
Yeah, I'll go a step further than James and say I don't think anybody should be making a profit off of this stuff. I'm fully in favor of nationalizing the fossil fuel industries. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. I do want to draw attention to something that Kendall said in the chat, though, which is important, about the need to reduce our energy usage through energy efficiency, because we do know that the cheapest megawatt hour and the cleanest is the one that we don't have to produce in the first place. And in Louisiana and in the South generally, we have a lot of opportunity for improvement in energy efficiency in our housing stock and our building stock generally. So, really robust investment in energy efficiency should come first, because that's the lowest hanging fruit. And that's, one of the alternatives that's in place. Another thing that I would mention too, just to Lane's point about, stopping these LNG facilities and, the price increases that they drive. I know the People versus Fossil Fuels campaign has been pushing very heavily to have President Biden issue a climate emergency under the Emergency Powers Act, which would give him broad authority to do things like stop oil and gas leasing in the Gulf and all sorts of things. And if you've been paying attention to the Inflation Reduction Act, you know that all in wind and solar leasing has been tied to oil and gas leasing in that legislation. And so, in my opinion, it doesn't look like we're going to get the kind of climate action we need through the current composition of the Congress. So executive action, bold executive action on the level of declaring a climate emergency, I think is a necessary step, and something that could be easily accomplished with a stroke of a pen. But I'll shut up there. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I have one.
Okay, Miss Catherine, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm tonight just opened my eyes up to some more stuff, and I just think that somebody needs to do something about putting a cap on something, because these poor people here, anywhere in this country, is not going to be able to afford what's going on right here in Louisiana. This is going on right here in our faces, and I had no idea. I always tried to follow commodities because of the commodities, the cocoa, the flour, and the oil, right? I used to always follow it, and just lately I started looking at the cocoa and the flour, but I never thought of it the way that y'all explained that to me tonight. And it's like, that needs to be capped. And I don't know, do we start with our council people about that? Do we start on the state level? Do we start in DC? Who do we talk to about this?
Ms. Catherine, I would say we start with all of the above. It's time for all of us. We are the ones that are going to make the difference, even if we don't want to.
And I'll say there is a lot of opportunity at the local and state level, and I personally think we need to, at least in Louisiana, focus a lot of our attention at the state level, particularly on the Public Service Commission. If you go back to that slide I showed earlier about the way that we generate electricity in this state, I mean, over 70% of our electricity generation comes from natural gas, the combustion of natural gas, versus less than 50% nationally. So, there's a lot of opportunity to change the way that we're producing electricity in this state, that falls under the authority of the Public Service Commission. A lot has been made of the climate action plan that our governor commissioned. And if you look in that document under the energy portion, the very first action item is what's called a renewable portfolio standard, a policy that would require electric utilities to generate electricity, an escalating percentage of their electricity from renewable energy sources. So that's a policy that could be put in place by the Public Service Commission that could make a huge impact on our greenhouse gas emissions in this state, and on our utility bills, how much they cost us. And I would just add, to cap that off, that this fall, 2 out of 5 seats on that body are up for election, including the District 3, which covers most of Orleans Parish, and District 4, which covers Southwest Louisiana, where James is. And on a 5-member body, it only takes 3 votes for good policy. So, there's opportunity to strike there. It just takes organization. That's why we have folks.
So how do you qualify?
Qualifying ended already in July, but there are challengers to both incumbents in the districts that are up for election. Devontae Lewis and Pastor Gregory Manning are both running for District 3. And I know that there are challengers in District 4 as well, though I cannot name them off the top of my head. Jessica or somebody else on the call might be able to do that.
So we start with them. Do we send letters to them? What do we have to do to get this started?
Well, as Zach said, I would just encourage you to stay plugged in to the Alliance, Sierra Club, Bucket Brigade. We're all working on this, and I know all of our organizations are going to be focusing, I think, effort on this Public Service Commission race in the fall. So stay tuned in. We'll have action alerts and things that you can do to engage.
I'd say one.
I'd like to give a plug. I'm sorry, I'll finish this real quick. I'd like to give a plug that I put in the chat to Gregory Manning's creation, the Greater New Orleans Interfaith Climate Coalition, because on that website, there's a lot of references as to where else you can go. So it's just a place to start.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is, just like you weren't quite aware of what was all going on until tonight, your neighbors are the same way, right? My neighbors are the same way. We have got to raise the awareness of every person in this state and really in this country of what is being stolen from us, taken out from under us, for corporate greed and profit at all of our expenses. And people don't know. They don't know what they don't know. So please tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your mama, tell everybody,
Yeah, that was the purpose of this teach-in, and that's why we're making the recording available. We want this to be a permanent resource for people so that we can get people to understand what we're talking about, that, fundamentally, that when we're talking about natural gas, we're using industry marketing terms. That was a phrase that was created by the industry. Yeah, fossil gas or fracked gas.
Correct everybody I talk to. It's talking about natural gas. It's not natural. It's fossil. It's fossil fuel. And people kind of look at you like, oh no, but it's the green alternative. That's all marketing bullshit. It really is all marketing BS. It really is. I have one more question, just a small. I think it's a small one. I don't want to. Okay.
No, please.
I just want to try to understand. Is because there's these huge prices set because of the export and because these there are people willing to pay so much more, and that's setting the price of natural gas, excuse me, of fossil gas in for everybody. Is that right? In other words, now when our utilities are buying natural gas, they're having to pay those prices. Is that correct? I
Yeah.
know it seems simple, but I just want to make sure I've got that right. They're buying out of the same stream. What's weird about that is, I mean, I think of a fire hose with under huge pressure and at 200 minus 241, whatever it is degrees. We don't need, is that how natural fossil gas is distributed, for example, in Louisiana? Does it have to be liquefied to be transported?
No,
Because if not, then it's like a butter box. We're paying all this to freeze it and liquefy it, and then we're buying from that stream, but we got to unfreeze it and gasify it.
No. It's only frozen when it's exported. So it's a lot going on. I know we just hit you with the fire hose of information. So the thing is, like, this is just example numbers. In Europe, they're paying $40 a million BTU. Mm-hmm. We're paying $8 a million BTU because they can make 40 over there. They're going to ship as much as possible to make that $30 profit margin per unit, so it's millions and millions of dollars of profit. So because of that, because there's a huge arbitrage, a huge disparity between what they can get here and what they can get there, they're sending as much as they can. These gas companies are sending as much as they can to get as much profit as they can. So because of that, it makes our supply smaller and our demand is the same. So when the supply comes down and the demand is up, now you're paying more. So they're taking the supply out of the domestic market, and because of that, we're paying more. And they're making more off of us, and they're making more off of the
but they're stealing our minerals. They're stealing from us to give to somebody else because they're paying more, and we got to suffer the consequences.
That's right.
Mhm.
Thank you, guys.
You got it, Miss Catherine.
This has been such.
Oh my
incredible
God!
resource.
I can't believe. I mean, it's shocking to me, and
It is shocking.
I'm just in awe. That's all I got to say. And I wish I could show this to my neighborhood meeting this weekend, but I think it's going to be too long.
We can make it. I'll make you a short little elevator speech version of it if you need. I'm telling you, this is something your neighborhood association needs. The next neighborhood over association needs. I'm telling you, this message needs to get out to as many people as possible. We are exporting our future. The coast of Louisiana, the flat coast of Louisiana is under siege because of greenhouse gases, and we're paying for it through the nose at the same time. It's a terrible plan that's being on the back of every person, especially those in South Louisiana. So
when I look at that map of where the LNG terminals are and where they're putting them, you're right. You don't see many. You see one in the Northeast. I think there's one on the West Coast. And what's really sickening about what they're doing is they are putting, I'm sure you know better than I do, it is completely advertent that they're siting them where they are. Yeah, okay, shipping access, okay. But it's more than that. It's because they can buy the land cheaply. They get these incredible deals like ITEP and whatnot. And we have compliant regulators. That's just greed and graft. And we have compliant legislators. And we have populations we have big areas of populations that are poor. So they're basically, essentially, from the oil company's point of view, they're compliant too.
Populations that are poor and passive.
Yeah.
Environmental injustice. That's all that is.
Completely. And it's disgusting to see you. All you have to do is show that one. I'm gonna put that map, into a lot of my, communications. That map tells a whole story of of exploitation, injustice, and greed. It's disgusting. Sorry, I'll shut up.
I'm floored. Y'all just floored me. They stealing from us to give to somebody else, and energy is buying from them and messing all over us.
I love to hear this anger. I really do.
Well, it's getting on into the evening. Does anyone have any final questions before we close out?
Can we sit? I would like to have a roundtable discussion with our city council about what is actually going on, because I don't really think they understand it. They're not educated on what we just heard.
Well, I monitored, by the way, I monitored the joint committee hearing yesterday. And all I can say is I do think that many of them, especially a lot of the new members on the council are, but their hands are also tied by contracts that have been entered into before they came into office. I'm not excusing them, but they really seem to be trying to get some accountability out of Entergy. And I have never seen such a display of, I'll